Where's the park?
Georgetown campus.
How'd this come our way?
I approached Kyle at a bar.
What bar?
The net. We thought he was...
Someone Jo trusts with her life is about to betray her, and she has no idea it's already happening. Right now, somewhere in Jo's own team, someone is passing information to the people who took her. Not a stranger. Not some outside threat lurking in the shadows. Someone who has trained beside her. Someone who has sat across from her at a table. Someone who has probably saved her life at some point in the past. And the terrifying part is, Jo doesn't know it yet. Neither do the people closest to her. Lioness Season 3, Episode 3 is called The Bear is Infected, and once you understand what that title really means, you'll realize this might be the most dangerous episode of the season, not because of some massive firefight overseas, but because of what's quietly rotting from the inside, right under everyone's nose at home. Before we get into what's coming, let's quickly go back to where Episode 2 left us, because everything in Episode 3 builds directly on it. Jo was pulled off the street by 2 Russian agents right after leaving her own home. Not in some foreign country. Not during a mission. At home, in broad daylight, where she should have been safest. And we found out the reason behind it was bigger than a random act of revenge. Putin wanted his man back badly enough to send people onto American soil to make it happen. That single detail changes everything. This isn't a personal grudge anymore. This is a government-level problem, and problems at that level don't stay contained. They spread. Neil was left behind to deal with the wreckage, trying to hold his family together while his entire world was falling apart around him. Caitlyn, as usual, stepped in with her cold, calculated efficiency, trying to contain a situation that was already spiraling out across multiple agencies. By the end of Episode 2, one thing was painfully clear. The danger wasn't coming from somewhere far away anymore. It was already inside Jo's life. And that same idea, something dangerous already being inside, is exactly what Episode 3 seems to be building on. Except this time, it's not about Jo's house. It's about her team. The title alone tells you a lot if you sit with it for a second. The Bear is Infected is not a random phrase. In shows built around espionage and government secrecy, when someone talks about an infection, they're almost never talking about an actual virus. They're talking about a breach, a leak. Someone who shouldn't have access to sensitive information having it anyway, and using it. Based on everything we know about this episode, that's exactly the direction things are heading. Jo and her team are forced to face the fact that there is a breach somewhere inside their own operation, and that forces them into a risky, uncomfortable move to try and root out whoever is responsible. When I first thought about that, my mind immediately went back to how fast those 2 men showed up at Jo's front door in Episode 1. Think about the timing. They knew exactly where she lived. They knew exactly when to strike. That kind of precision doesn't come from luck. It comes from information, and information like that has to come from somewhere close. So the big question heading into this episode is simple, but heavy. Who is feeding information to the people trying to hurt Jo? This is where things get genuinely interesting, because there are a few names that immediately come to mind. Caitlyn has been acting unusually cold, even after Jo was taken, and at the time it felt like she might be running her own agenda underneath everything she does. Now that we know there's an actual infiltrator storyline coming, that theory feels a lot less like a wild guess, and a lot more like something the show has been quietly building toward all along. Caitlyn has access to nearly everything. She knows the missions. She knows the assets. And she has shown, more than once, that she is willing to make cold, brutal decisions if she believes it serves a bigger picture. None of that makes her guilty on its own, but it absolutely makes her someone worth watching closely in this episode. But Caitlyn isn't the only person who fits here, and honestly, the show would be doing something clever if it didn't go with the most obvious choice. There's also Cody and his special task force, who were directly involved in the Yurimov operation, the same operation that set all of this chaos in motion. Whoever leaked details about that extraction, whether it was who Yurimov actually was, where he was being held, or simply the fact that the operation was happening at all, would have had to be close to it. Cody's team was right there in the room. So was Jo's own crew. That means the traitor, if there really is only one, is probably someone we've already met. Maybe even someone we've already grown to trust a little. Now let's talk about what a risky move to root out an infiltrator might actually look like, because this is where the tension is going to hit hardest. In shows like this, flushing out a mole usually means setting a trap. That could mean feeding different pieces of false information to different members of the team, and watching to see which version of that information ends up in the wrong hands. It could mean putting someone under quiet surveillance without them ever knowing. It could even mean staging a fake operation just to see who reacts and how they react. If that's the direction the show takes, Jo is going to be forced into an incredibly uncomfortable position. She's going to have to treat people she trusts, maybe people she's fought beside for years, as suspects. And that kind of paranoia can tear a team apart just as easily as any outside enemy ever could. Honestly, that might end up being the real danger of this episode, not bullets. Suspicion. At the same time, Neil is going to be dealing with his own version of this fear, but from a completely different angle. The synopsis makes it clear that while the team is racing against time to find the leak, Neil is struggling with a rising fear of his own, and it's not hard to understand why. Put yourself in his position for a second. His wife was taken off the street in broad daylight. Armed men showed up at his front door in the middle of the night. His kids are scared, confused, and looking to him for answers he doesn't have. And now he has to sit there, mostly powerless, waiting to find out whether Jo is even still alive, while also wondering if the same people who took her could come back for the rest of the family. Neil is being pushed closer and closer to some kind of breaking point in this episode. Maybe he finally demands answers from Caitlyn that she isn't willing to give him. Maybe he starts making decisions entirely on his own to protect his kids. Decisions that could put him directly at odds with the very agency that's supposed to be protecting his family in the first place. Either way, it doesn't feel like Neil is going to sit quietly in the background anymore. His fear has to go somewhere, and episode 3 feels like the moment it finally comes out. Let's not forget that Jo herself is still out there the entire time this is happening. Even though most of this episode seems to focus on the hunt for the mole and the fear building at home, the show hasn't forgotten that Jo is still being held hostage somewhere. Based on everything we've seen of her so far, she isn't the kind of person who breaks easily, and there's no reason to think that changes here. If anything, the real tension of this episode probably comes from cutting between two timelines that are both racing against the same clock. On one side, the team is scrambling to find the leak before more damage can be done. On the other side, Jo, wherever she is fighting just to survive long enough to be found. When a show splits its tension like that, it usually means neither side gets to move forward easily. Every step the team takes toward finding the traitor is going to feel like it's happening while Jo's situation gets more dangerous, not less. There's something else worth thinking about here, and it's how this breach could connect directly back to Jo's kidnapping in the first place. If there really is an infiltrator inside the operation, it's very possible that this same person had a hand in exposing Jo to begin with. That would explain exactly how the Russian agents knew where to find her and when to strike. If that turns out to be true, then finding the mole isn't just about protecting future missions anymore. It becomes personal. It becomes the key to understanding why Jo was targeted in the first place, and possibly even the key to finding out where she's being held right now. That would raise the stakes of this episode significantly, because it stops being about internal security and starts being about survival. There's also something that's been sitting with me since episode 1. During the operation to capture Yurimov, Jo clearly wasn't comfortable with how things were handled. She questioned the mission even after it succeeded, because of how many people ended up dead in a war that had nothing to do with them. That kind of hesitation, that willingness to question orders instead of blindly following them, is exactly the kind of thing that can put someone at odds with the people running the operation from above. If Caitlyn or someone even higher up felt like Jo's growing doubts were becoming a liability, that opens up a completely different kind of motive. Not just protecting an asset like Yurimov, but controlling someone who's starting to ask too many uncomfortable questions. It sounds like an intense theory, but shows like this have gone in that exact direction before, where the real threat was never the enemy outside. It was always the system the main character was trained to trust. Now, let's talk about the FBI raid that was teased toward the end of episode 2. They managed to capture one of the people responsible for the attack on Jo's house, and episode 3 is likely going to lean heavily into what that capture reveals. Interrogating someone connected to a foreign kidnapping is exactly the kind of thing that could expose a leak inside the operation, especially if that person reveals how they knew where to find Jo in the first place. This could end up being the exact thread that connects the internal mole hunt with the external kidnapping plot, tying both storylines together in a way that feels earned instead of convenient. In other words, this episode might actually start answering some of the biggest questions from the first 2 episodes, even while it opens up a whole new set of them. There's also the emotional weight this episode is likely going to carry, and it shouldn't be underestimated. This season has done an incredible job blending high-stakes espionage with the personal cost it takes on Joe's family, and there's no reason to think that changes here. If the team spends this episode turning on each other, even a little, out of suspicion, that's going to hit differently than a normal mission going wrong. These are people who have relied on each other in life or death situations before. Watching that trust start to crack, especially while Joe herself is in danger and completely unable to do anything about it, is going to be incredibly hard to watch in the best possible way. This feels like the kind of episode that leaves people talking, not because of one big action sequence, but because of how uncomfortable and tense the entire atmosphere becomes. So here's where things stand. Episode 3 is likely going to give us our first real look at who might be behind the leak, even if it doesn't fully confirm it yet. Neil is likely going to reach some kind of breaking point at home, possibly clashing with Caitlyn or taking matters into his own hands. The FBI's captured suspect is likely going to reveal something that ties directly back into the mole hunt. And there's a strong chance we get at least one more glimpse of Joe as a hostage, reminding everyone that no matter what's happening back home, she is still out there fighting to survive. Whether Caitlyn ends up being the one behind all of this, or the show is clever enough to point us towards someone we haven't even considered yet, The Bear is Infected has all the pieces in place to be one of the most tense episodes of the season so far. Let's slow down for a second and dig deeper into the idea of a mole hunt itself, because it's worth really sitting with. When a show introduces the idea that someone inside the operation can't be trusted, it changes the entire rhythm of how every scene plays out. Every conversation suddenly carries a second layer underneath it. When two characters talk in a hallway, you're no longer just listening to what they're saying. You're watching how they say it, wondering if there's something they're hiding. Episode 3 is likely going to lean into that heavily. Even ordinary moments, a briefing room conversation, a quiet check-in between teammates, are probably going to feel loaded with tension, because at this point in the story, we genuinely don't know who to trust either. And that's part of what makes this kind of storyline so effective. The show doesn't need a big dramatic reveal in every single scene to keep you on edge. It just needs you constantly asking yourself who's lying. There's also Westfield, someone we haven't talked about as much, but who could end up being important in a storyline like this. He's positioned close to both Caitlyn and Joe, which means he has access to a lot of sensitive information, without necessarily being seen as the face of the operation. Characters like that are often the ones a show uses to surprise its audience, because everyone is so focused on the obvious power players that a quieter figure working in the background can slip past unnoticed. It's not that Westfield is definitely the one feeding information to the wrong people, but he's someone worth paying close attention to in this episode, especially if we see him reacting strangely to any part of the mole hunt. There's also the question of motive, because a leak like this doesn't usually happen without a reason. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's blackmail, where someone is being forced to hand over information because the alternative is worse for them personally. And sometimes, especially in shows built around moral gray areas like this one, it's ideology. Someone genuinely believing that what they're doing is right, even if it means betraying the people around them. If Joe's growing doubts about the ethics of these missions have been noticed by someone else on the team, it's possible there's another character who shares those same doubts. But instead of raising them the way Joe did, they decided to act on them in a far more dangerous way. That would make the traitor not a villain in the classic sense, but someone who genuinely believes they're doing the right thing, which tends to make for a much more compelling and uncomfortable storyline. Now let's talk about what this means for Joe specifically, because it's easy to focus so much on the mole hunt itself that we forget how personal this really is for her. Joe has spent years building relationships with the people on her team. These aren't just coworkers to her. They're the people she trusts with her life every single time she goes out on a mission. If it turns out that one of them betrayed her, even indirectly, that's going to hit her in a way no outside enemy ever could. This season has already spent a lot of time on Joe questioning the cost of her work, both professionally and personally. Finding out that the danger came from inside her own circle could be the final push that makes her seriously reconsider everything about the life she's built, the choices she's made, and the people she's chosen to trust along the way. And that, more than any gunfight or car chase, might be what makes The Bear is Infected, the episode that changes everything going.